Fiery dawn on New Avalon. Unannounced, the Drek fleet appeared from the void. Black warships tore through the sky, like obsidian knives slicing azure silk. Initially, there was disbelief. Contact with alien life had always been a distant possibility, but an invasion? That was unthinkable. The colony of New Avalon, humanity's emerald jewel, just 2 decades old, was a beacon of progress, nestled on a lush, Earth-like world. Here, there were schools, markets, and towering residential complexes, a place to call home. Then, the bombardments began. The first attack leveled the colony's main communication tower, severing the fragile link to Earth. In a blink, defense systems sprang to life. Railguns swiveled skyward, missile silos opened like furious mechanical flowers. But the Drek warships were too fast, their technology eons beyond human comprehension. Searing plasma beams rained down like a meteor shower, obliterating key military structures before a single human missile could find its mark. Governor Anya Petrova stood in the underground command center, watching in horror as reports flooded in. Civilian districts were engulfed in flames, defensive forces scattered. The Drek had breached the outer perimeters. "We have to negotiate," Petrova exclaimed, her voice tight with desperation. "We surrender." But surrender was not in the Drek vocabulary. When the Drek landed, their legions moved with chilling efficiency. Armor as black as night, gleaming like wet obsidian. Their commander, Overlord Forlag, a 4-armed Goliath, bone-white plating masking his face, issued his decree just once through the city's shattered public address system. "You are now property of the Drek Empire. Obey, or be erased." Life under Drek rule was suffocating. The once vibrant colony now cowered under ruthless curfews. Armed Drek patrols prowled the streets, their heavy boots echoing on concrete. Towering glass buildings, once home to thriving businesses, became command posts and supply depots. The Drek segregated the population into sectors. Those deemed useful were enslaved in factories and mines, while the rest were confined to cramped ghettos under constant surveillance. Resistance seemed futile. At least, that was what the Drek wanted them to believe. Those who dared to resist vanished without a trace. Public executions became a grim ritual, a stark reminder of the futility of defiance. Agent Reese Kale, a former military strategist, lurked in the shadows, his jaw clenched in fury. He had fought in many wars, but this was different. This was not mere occupation. This was the systematic annihilation of a people. Initially, there were only whispers. Someone had stolen weapons from a Drek armory. Supply convoys were sabotaged. Explosions rattled Drek outposts in the dead of night. A legend was born. The fractured and terrified resistance suddenly had something to believe in. They whispered of the masked man, a phantom emerging from the shadows and vanishing without a trace. Nameless, origin unknown, driven by a singular purpose. They called him Spectre. Overlord Forlag did not believe in ghosts. He believed in control. And this masked insurgent threatened that control. He ordered an immediate crackdown. Drek forces raided homes, interrogated civilians, imposed brutal curfews. But the attacks did not stop. They even escalated. Supply lines were severed. Drek officers were found dead in their own command centers, throats slit with terrifying precision. Forlag was unaccustomed to fear, but this was truly different. Humans were supposed to be weak, yet they rallied behind a nameless warrior. Then, one night, as the Drek prepared yet another operation to hunt down the insurgents, a message appeared, etched deep into the steel walls of the command center. "You occupy New Avalon, but you do not own it. You never will." It was then that Forlag realized the truth. The war was not over. It had just begun. The Drek supply depot stood at the heart of their occupied territory, a fortress of steel and energy shields. Guard towers loomed over the perimeter, plasma cannons sweeping the darkened streets. Inside, Crates of weapons, rations, and fuel were stacked in neat rows, enough resources to sustain the Drek occupation indefinitely. It was impenetrable, or so they thought. A lone figure lurked in the shadows, masked, clad in dark armor that blended with the night. He moved like a wraith, slipping past Drek patrols with perfect timing and precision. Time was everything. He had studied their routines for weeks, memorizing every shift change, every blind spot. The Drek, in their arrogance, believed no human could challenge them in their own domain. That hubris would be their undoing. Spectre scaled the wall, reaching a ventilation shaft. He slid inside, crawling silently through the ducts until he reached the main storage hall of the depot below. Drek soldiers patrolled amongst the supply crates. Their alien voices murmured indistinctly. He counted 6, too many for a direct confrontation. That wasn't his style. Instead, he reached into his belt, pulled out a small device, and pressed a button. Across the compound, near the eastern perimeter, a deafening explosion ripped through the air. Walls trembled. Drek soldiers snapped to attention, barking orders, weapons raised. They failed to notice the masked man slipping from the vent, moving like a shadow. Spectre planted the charges in key locations: fuel reserves, weapon stacks, supply crates. By the time the Drek realized the diversion was a ruse, he was already gone. The explosion that followed was not just destruction, it was a message. The Drek watched in horror as their supply depot erupted in flames. Supplies vaporized in an instant. The ground quaked from the blast, sending debris raining down like a fiery storm. Their once impenetrable fortress was now a smoldering ruin. And somewhere in the darkness, Spectre vanished into the night. The tale of the audacious raid spread like wildfire. Whispers became conversations, conversations into chants. The once broken people of New Avalon found hope again. They had a name to rally behind: Spectre. The Resistance, once a collection of scattered and fearful survivors, now had purpose. Inspired by his actions, they grew bolder. Hit-and-run raids became routine. Drek patrols started vanishing, leaving behind their armor as eerie trophies. But it wasn't just the humans who felt the shift. The Drek, for the first time, felt something they had never anticipated on this backwater human colony: fear. Forlag slammed his fist against the command table, his forefingers curling into a fist. The room fell silent, filled with high-ranking Drek officers, none daring to speak. The depot explosion had been one thing, but now even his own soldiers whispered about the masked man. This Spectre is nothing but an insect. Forlag roared, his voice like grinding stone. And insects are crushed. But he was no fool. This masked man was no mere reckless insurgent. He was calculated, precise, elusive. Forlag had led planetary campaigns before, but this was different. No brute force assault would subdue Spectre. So he changed the game. The trap was simple: a staged attack on the civilian sectors, an easy target, lightly defended. The Resistance would have no choice but to respond. And when they did, Spectre would reveal himself. The Drek set their plan in motion. They advanced towards the civilian zones with feigned aggression, firing warning shots, demolishing small buildings, but sparing human lives. They needed bait, not corpses. And then he appeared. From the rooftops, a lone figure leaped down, landing in the street with unnatural grace. The masked man stood still for a moment, observing them. The Drek hesitated. He had never revealed himself so openly before. Forlag smirked. The ambush closed in. Dozens of Drek warriors emerged from the alleys, plasma rifles aimed. Spectre did not flee, did not fight. He simply raised his hands in surrender. The Drek, for all their might, had expected anything but this. Reese Kale sat in chains, wrists bound by Drek restraints, humming with energy far beyond human technology. The interrogation chamber was sterile, a stark contrast to the war-torn streets outside. Across from him, Overlord Forlag loomed, for arms folded across his armored chest. His bone-plated face betrayed no emotion. For hours, the Drek interrogated him, cycling through threats and intimidation. They dragged in resistance members, lined them up, executed them one by one, waiting for Reese to break. But he never did. "You are an anomaly," Forlag finally spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "Humans do not fight like this. They cower, they submit." Reese smirked, leaning back as much as his bindings allowed. "Funny, your supply depot didn't seem to think so." Forlag's fingers twitched, the only sign of frustration. "You believe yourself untouchable because you hide in shadows and trickery. But now you are here, in my hands. Nothing more than flesh and bone." Reese met his gaze with unwavering confidence. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not in your hands. I'm in your head." Silence filled the room, a long, heavy silence. Forlag leaned forward, his plated face inches from Reese. "You are either the bravest human I have encountered," he said, his voice low, "or the most foolish." Reese shrugged. "Why not both?" The Overlord studied him for a moment longer, then did something no one in the room expected. He laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was deep, guttural, a laugh that echoed like distant thunder. "You amuse me, Spectre," Forlag said, "but amusement is not enough to save your people. So, I offer you a choice." Reese tilted his head. "Oh? This should be good." "A duel," Forlag announced, rising to his full towering height. "You and I, one-on-one. If you win, I leave this planet, and humanity keeps its colony." Reese arched a brow. "And if I lose?" Forlag's expression darkened. "Then every human on this planet dies." The room tensed. The Drek officers standing guard shifted uneasily. Even they had not anticipated this. Reese took a slow breath, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. One fight, a single battle, to determine the fate of an entire world. He exhaled. "Well," he said finally, flashing a cocky grin, "I do love a challenge." The announcement of the duel sent shockwaves through both sides. Humans clung to hope, desperately praying for a miracle. The Drek, despite their outward bravado, whispered amongst themselves. No one had ever seen Forlag fight in single combat. He was a warlord, a strategist, not a frontline soldier. Why risk everything on a duel? The answer was simple: pride. The duel was set to take place in the heart of New Avalon, where the colony's once pristine government plaza now lay in ruins. The Drek broadcast the event, ensuring that every human and alien alike would witness what they believed to be humanity's final defeat. Reese stood in the center of the clearing, unarmed, waiting. His mask was gone now, revealing sharp blue eyes and a face etched with experience and defiance. He had fought battles before, but none like this, none where the stakes were so absolute. The ground trembled as Forlag entered, his obsidian armor gleaming under the artificial lights. He carried a weapon unlike any Reese had seen before, a massive energy blade humming with barely contained power. A Drek official raised a clawed hand. "Begin." Forlag moved first, swinging the blade in a downward arc meant to cleave Reese in two. But Reese was not there. He had already rolled to the side, dodging with practiced agility. The blade struck the ground, sending cracks spider-webbing through the concrete. Reese surged forward, aiming for the Overlord's side, but Forlag was fast, faster than any being his size had a right to be. A backhand sent Reese flying, skidding across the ground. Pain flared in his ribs, but he pushed himself up, refusing to stay down. The Drek cheered, the humans held their breath. Reese wiped blood from his lip and grinned. "Is that all you got?" Forlag lunged again, but this time Reese was ready. He ducked under the strike, pivoted, and landed a solid kick to the Drek's knee joint. The Overlord staggered, just for a second, but it was enough. Reese pressed his advantage, weaving around the Warlord's strikes, searching for an opening. The fight was brutal, relentless. Every time Forlag struck, Reese dodged just enough to stay alive. Every time Reese attacked, he found small cracks in the Overlord's defenses. Then something changed. As the battle raged, the screens displaying the fight flickered for a brief moment. Symbols appeared, strange glowing symbols, not of human design. Reese froze. The symbols weren't random. They were Drek, and they were on his mask. Forlag hesitated, his grip on his weapon tightening. The crowd murmured. The Drek soldiers watching from the sidelines exchanged uncertain glances. "WH, is that?" Forlag breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is that?" Reese, despite the pain coursing through his body, smirked. "Oh, you're going to love this." The symbols continued to flicker across the screens, ghostly remnants of a language that no human should have known. They pulsed with an eerie glow, reflecting off Reese's face as he stood battered but grinning before the mighty Forlag. The Drek warlord had been confident, untouchable, but now he was afraid. Forlag stepped back, his massive frame tensing. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, his voice low, almost uncertain. Reese exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Would you believe me if I said I found it?" The Drek officers watching from the sidelines murmured amongst themselves. The crowd of human captives, once resigned to watching their last hope fall, now stared in confusion and curiosity. This was no ordinary human. The symbols glowed again, pulsing in time with Reese's heartbeat. Then, as if responding to some unseen command, his mask, Spectre's mask, materialized back over his face. Forlag, for hands gripped his weapon tighter. "That mask is not human." Reese shrugged. "Yeah, figured that out." The fight had stopped, but the war had shifted. Forlag hesitated. He was a warrior, a conqueror, a being who had subjugated entire civilizations without a second thought. And yet here he stood, locked in battle with a man wearing something his own people did not understand. The Drek prided themselves on being the dominant species in the universe, but dominance required absolute knowledge. And what the mask represented, what it proved, was that they didn't know everything. Reese could see the uncertainty creeping in. He could see the cracks forming, not just in Forlag, but in the Drek as a whole. Time to widen them. Reese took a slow step forward. "You think you're the first ones to come for us?" His voice carried across the ruins of New Avalon. "You think this is the first time humanity has faced extinction?" Silence. Reese tapped the side of his mask, and suddenly the flickering Drek symbols changed. Images flashed across the screens. Old battlefields, ships that looked eerily similar to Drek warships, but adorned with unfamiliar markings. And then the final image, a massive Drek flag being burned. Forlag inhaled sharply. "No," he whispered. Reese tilted his head. "Oh, you recognize that, don't you?" The Drek officers shifted uneasily. The human prisoners didn't understand what they were seeing, but the Drek did. They recognized those symbols, those battlefields, a history long buried. Forlag turned sharply to his officers. "Tell me this is a fabrication." The highest-ranking Drek scholar among them, an elder with deep-set violet eyes, hesitated. That hesitation told Forlag everything. "You knew." Forlag hissed, his grip on his blade faltered. Reese chuckled. "Your empire isn't the first to rise, Forlag. You thought you were the apex, but you were just the ones left standing when the dust settled." He gestured to his mask. "And this is proof." The crowd murmured louder. Doubt crept into the ranks of the Drek soldiers. The mighty conquerors were now uncertain. Forlag's mind raced. He had always believed in the Drek's divine right to rule, their superiority over lesser species. But if what this human was saying was true, if their ancestors had once lost, then everything he had built, everything he had fought for, was a lie. Reese saw the doubt, he saw the hesitation, and he pressed. "You're standing on the bones of a warrior people, lost to time," Reese said, his voice low but powerful. "And now you've got a choice, Overlord Forlag." Forlag stared at him, silent. "Keep fighting a battle you already lost centuries ago," Reese said. his voice low but powerful. Or leave. The Drek leader exhaled slowly. The weight of his people's buried history pressed down on him, heavier than any battle he had ever fought. He raised his weapon again, gripping it tight for a moment. It seemed like he would attack, that he would fight until the very end. But then, before the entire Drek fleet, before every human watching, he dropped his blade. It clattered against the broken pavement, the sound of an empire's pride shattering. The Drek forces, leaderless and shaken, wavered. Without orders, without certainty, they were nothing. And Reese simply stood there, mask still glowing, waiting to see if the Overlord had the courage to make the right choice. Forlag stood motionless, his breathing heavy. Around him, his soldiers waited for an order, any order, but none came. The Drek warlord, once so sure of his people's place in the universe, now faced a truth he could not ignore. The history they had built their empire upon was a lie. Slowly, deliberately, he turned away from Reese and looked at the faces of his warriors. They were confused, some angry, others uncertain. They had believed themselves invincible, that their empire was eternal. And yet here they were, staring at a single human who had shattered that illusion. He could fight, he could kill the human where he stood, but the fight was already over. Forlag raised a hand. "We leave," he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. His second-in-command hesitated. Forlag snapped towards him, eyes burning. "I said we leave." The command rippled through the Drek forces. At first, there was resistance, murmurs of defiance, of dishonor. But then, the reality settled in. If they stayed, if they continued this war, they would not just be fighting the humans. They would be fighting the truth itself. One by one, the Drek ships began their retreat. Troops marched back towards their transports, abandoning outposts and fortifications that had been built with the intention of never leaving. The humans, still reeling from what they had just witnessed, watched in stunned silence as the invaders simply left. New Avalon had been conquered, and then just as suddenly, it had been freed. The battle was over. The celebration should have begun immediately. People poured into the streets, embracing, laughing, crying. The colony had been moments from destruction, and now, against all odds, they were victorious. But Rescale was gone. As the last Drek ships lifted into the sky, the man in the mask had slipped away, disappearing into the ruins of the city. The resistance searched for him, calling his name, but found nothing. No mask, no weapons, no sign that he had ever been there. "Where is he?" Governor Petrova asked, scanning the horizon. No one knew. Some believed he had been killed in the chaos. Others thought he had never existed at all, that Spectre was merely a symbol created by desperate minds in desperate times. But those who had fought beside him knew better. The man who had challenged an empire, who had stood face to face with a warlord and made him question his entire existence. He was still out there, somewhere. The colony began to rebuild. The people of New Avalon, no longer shackled by fear, worked together to repair what had been lost. Buildings were reconstructed, streets were cleared. The scars of war remained, but now they were reminders of survival, not defeat. And through it all, the legend of Spectre grew. Children whispered his name in the dark, telling stories of the masked warrior who had defied the Drek. Some believed he would return if they were ever in danger again. Others thought he had moved on to fight another battle on another world. One thing was certain. He was more than just a man now. He was a myth. Far beyond New Avalon, beyond the stars, a figure stood on the edge of an unknown world, gazing up at a sky filled with possibilities. He had done what he needed to do, but there were always more battles to fight, more truths to uncover. And as long as there were tyrants in the universe who thought themselves untouchable, the man in the mask would be watching, waiting. And when the time came, he would rise again.